There's something haunting about the way certain people move through the world. They can feel the temperature of a room before anyone else notices. They anticipate emotions before they are spoken. They absorb pain, almost as if their nervous system was designed to be a sponge. We call them empaths today, but Carl Jung might have seen them differently. Not simply as gifted individuals, but as wounded children who were forced to grow antennae just to survive. Jung's final message, if we listen carefully, whispers a truth that cuts deeper than most of us are comfortable admitting. The empath is simply the child who was never allowed to be selfish. To be selfish, in childhood, is not a sin but a necessity. It is the raw assertion of I exist, the unfiltered cry of a soul learning where its boundaries begin and where the world ends. But for many, this natural selfishness was stamped out too early. The child learned that expressing needs meant rejection, punishment, or shame. So instead of asking for love, they learned to anticipate the needs of others. Instead of developing a strong I, they developed a strong radar for you. And decades later, as adults, these children became the very people we now label empaths. What Jung understood, and what many of us forget, is that empathy without roots in a healthy self is not compassion but compulsion. It is not a spiritual gift, but a survival strategy that never outgrew its childhood soil. This video explores that idea in detail, the origins of the empath, the psychological dangers of repressed selfishness, and the path Jung laid out for reclaiming the lost self. Because perhaps the final message isn't just about empathy, it's about liberation. It's about finally giving ourselves permission to be who we were never allowed to be. 1. The nature of the empath. The term empath has become almost mystical in modern culture. It is often wrapped in images of spiritual giftedness, as though to feel others deeply is a superpower. But in Jungian psychology, empathy is not so much magic as it is adaptation. An empath, in this sense, is someone who has overdeveloped their capacity to sense others because their own sense of self was compromised early on. Jung might not have used the word empath, but he would recognize the archetype. It echoes the wounded healer, the figure who helps others precisely because of their own unhealed pain. At its core, empathy is neither good nor bad. In Jung's language, it is an archetypal energy, neutral until given form through human experience. Healthy empathy allows us to connect, to love, to bridge the terrifying gap between two separate selves. But compulsive empathy, empathy rooted in trauma, is different. It is not chosen, it is automatic. The empath feels what others feel not because they wish to, but because they cannot not feel it. Their psychic boundaries are porous, leaving them vulnerable to being flooded by the emotions of others. This raises a critical question. Is empathy, in its extreme form, really compassion? Jung would argue no. True compassion comes from wholeness, from a stable self that can hold space for others without collapsing. The empath, by contrast, often sacrifices themselves unconsciously in order to keep others stable. This is why Jung's insight is so striking. What we celebrate as extraordinary empathy is often just a coping mechanism, the scar tissue of a child who was not permitted to prioritize their own being. 2. Childhood origins of the empath. Every empath's story begins in a home where selfhood was unsafe. For some, it was an environment of overt control. A parent who punished every sign of independence. A family that demanded obedience over authenticity. For others, it was subtler. Love that was given conditionally. Affection that flowed only when the child behaved in ways that pleased the parent. In both cases, the message was the same. Your needs are too much, your desires are inconvenient, your self must shrink. The child, desperate for survival, adapts. If crying for comfort brings rejection, they learn to stop crying. If anger is met with punishment, they bury their anger. If expressing desire is ridiculed, they stop desiring openly. Slowly, the natural selfishness of childhood, the me-first instinct that teaches boundaries and self-worth, is suppressed. What emerges in its place is hypervigilance. The child scans the emotional weather of the household, learns to predict shifts in mood and molds themselves into whatever will bring peace. This is the birth of the empath. Jung warned repeatedly about the dangers of denying natural impulses. When a child cannot be selfish, that selfishness does not vanish. It is pushed into the unconscious where it festers as shadow. Ironically, it is this very repression that gives rise to the exaggerated empathy we see later in life. The adult empath appears saintly, endlessly giving, endlessly attuned, but beneath the surface lies the unacknowledged child, still yearning to scream, "What about me?" This split, Jung would say, is the root of their suffering. 3. The repression of selfishness. To understand why Jung placed such importance on selfishness, we must first strip the word of its moral weight. In childhood, selfishness is not greed. It is the primal declaration of existence. A baby cries for food not because it is manipulative but because it must. A toddler demands attention not because they are arrogant, but because their sense of self is just beginning to form. These early acts of selfishness are the building blocks of identity. To crush them is to fracture the child's emerging ego. When selfishness is repressed, the psyche compensates. Instead of learning how to balance self with others, the individual grows up lopsided, overly focused on external validation, unable to assert their own needs. Jung saw this as a dangerous imbalance. The shadow swells with all the denied impulses, waiting for a chance to erupt. But instead of exploding outward, many empaths implode inward, collapsing into depression, exhaustion, or hidden resentment. Their goodness becomes a prison. This is why Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires the integration of shadow, including the selfish child. To reclaim selfishness is not to become cruel but to restore balance. It is to say, I too deserve space in the world. I too have the right to exist apart from serving others. Without this reclamation, the empath remains trapped in a distorted version of empathy, one that costs them their very soul. 4. The shadow of the empath. Every strength, Jung reminded us, hides a shadow. The empath, so celebrated for their endless capacity to feel, also carries an unseen darkness. On the surface, they appear generous, loving, and selfless. The person who will always answer your call at 2 a.m., who always knows what to say, who always places your needs before theirs. But beneath this glowing exterior often lies exhaustion, bitterness, and a quiet rage that has never been given voice. Jung would say this is the shadow of empathy, the unacknowledged resentment of a self forever sacrificed. The problem with compulsive empathy is that it masquerades as virtue. Society praises the empath for being caring, for giving without question, for sacrificing endlessly. Few stop to ask what it costs them. And because the empath's identity is built on being the good one, They rarely stop to ask either. Instead, their shadow grows heavier. They feel unappreciated, unseen, invisible. They wonder why the people they save do not save them in return. Yet they cannot admit this anger, because to do so would feel like betrayal. Betrayal of their role, their image, even their survival strategy. Jung insisted that what is repressed will eventually find expression, often in twisted forms. For the empath, this might mean sudden emotional outbursts, passive aggressiveness, or even self-sabotage. Sometimes it manifests as illness, the body carrying the burden of all the unspoken no's. Other times it emerges in toxic relationships, where the empath unconsciously chooses partners who exploit their giving nature, reenacting the childhood wound. This is the tragic irony of the empath's shadow. In their quest to protect others, they abandon themselves, and the abandoned self always finds a way to make itself known. 5. Individuation and the integration of selfishness. For Jung, the central task of life was individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the hidden, rejected, and unconscious parts of ourselves. For the empath, this means turning inward to embrace the one figure they have ignored for decades, the selfish child. The very part of them they were taught to suppress, the voice that says I want, I need, me first, is precisely the part that must be welcomed back into the psyche. Without it, the empath remains half a person, defined not by who they are, but by who others need them to be. Reclaiming selfishness does not mean becoming cruel or narcissistic. Rather, it means learning to draw boundaries, to say no, to refuse roles that drain the soul. It means accepting that self-care is not indulgence but necessity. Jung believed that real empathy could only emerge from this wholeness. When a person has honored their own needs, their empathy is no longer a survival reflex. It becomes a conscious choice. They can give freely because they have not abandoned themselves in the process. This integration is not easy. It often requires years of shadow work, therapy, or deep self-reflection. It requires breaking the inner contract signed in childhood, the belief that love must always be earned, that worth is tied to usefulness, that selfishness is a sin. Yet, as the empath slowly embraces their shadow, a transformation occurs. They stop being the sponge that soaks up the pain of others, and instead become the container that can hold both self and other without collapsing. In Jung's terms, they step closer to individuation, the union of opposites that makes a human being whole. Conclusion. Carl Jung's final message about the empath is not a condemnation but a call to awakening. To say that the empath is just the child who was never allowed to be selfish is to reveal the hidden wound behind the gift. It is to remind us that empathy, in its compulsive form, is not innate goodness but a survival adaptation, one born from a childhood where selfhood was forbidden. And while this adaptation may look noble, it comes at a terrible cost, the loss of the authentic self. But Jung also offers hope. By reclaiming the selfish child, by integrating the shadow we were taught to reject, we discover that selfishness and empathy are not opposites but partners. To honor the self is not to abandon others, but to ensure that our giving flows from fullness rather than emptiness. True empathy, the kind that heals without destroying, is only possible once we have learned to love ourselves enough to protect our own existence. So perhaps Jung's final message is really an invitation. To the empath, stop apologizing for wanting. Stop shrinking to make others comfortable. Stop mistaking martyrdom for love. Give yourself permission to be selfish, because only then will your empathy be real, not as a scar from your past, but as a conscious act of your wholeness. Only then will you embody not just the wounded healer but the healed one, the person who can finally say, I am, and because I am, I can truly love you too.